Hello, everyone. Good evening. Such a pleasure to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming to this inaugural event of the Climate and Justice Group for the academic year 2025-2026. The Climate and Justice Group is an interdisciplinary group of approximately 40 researchers between the School of Social Sciences and the School of Environment, Education and Development. We organize a series of talks and events that help us cultivate a stronger sense of interdisciplinarity and connection around issues related to law, regulation, justice, and climate and environmental issues, broadly speaking. And it's such a great pleasure to have our speaker here with us today, Dr. Amiera Sawas. She is the head of research and policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She is a feminist researcher and advocate working at the intersections of climate change, gender justice, public participation, and the social contract. She has a PhD on water, climate, and human rights in Pakistan. I could go on for ages because she's so lovely. She's a contributing author to the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report on Gender and Climate Security. As a person of both Syrian and Irish heritage with close links to Pakistan, she has lived life with an acute awareness of the impacts of colonial histories and believes passionately in the need to decolonize. And I'm sure you'll be talking a lot about that with us today. And in her talk, to slightly preempt what you should expect, she will share how the proposed fossil fuel treaty is a platform for solidarity, policies toward a more fair macroeconomic and climate system. And it's such a great pleasure for us to have you here today. Thank you so much. And without further ado, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff. We, as you can see, are a big, bold proposal. And so there are like lots of big, bold ideas and issues that we deal with or attempt to deal with. But it might feel like, firstly, some of you might be greater experts in a number of the areas that I'm going to talk about than I am. So if I seem to be giving you the 101 patronizing thing, that's not my intention. We just cover a lot. And so, yeah, like it will feel like a lot of information, but really looking forward to your thoughts. And if there's something that's not making sense or I'm rushing through it, just put your hand up and let me know. Back. Okay, but I'm not a lawyer, even if sometimes I wish I was, to be honest. I actually did my undergraduate here in psychology. I grew up not far from here in South Manchester. And then when I was doing that, I did psychology because basically I was trying to make sense of my own weirdness and like how I was looking at the world. And, you know, like I grew up in a very multicultural family. I didn't look at the world the way that a lot of my peers who grew up here did, and particularly around issues of justice and issues of like positionality and identity. I always felt like I don't know who I am. I don't know like what I am. And so I think I did psychology because I was trying to make sense of that as well as other things. But I started moving more into the social psychology side and the political psychology side when I was doing that work. So I ended up doing a master's in global politics. And then sort of realizing, oh, wow, like injustice is systemic. I sort of had a sense of that because I grew up with families that on both sides of the family experienced colonization, but I wasn't like fully aware of how that was linked to the capitalist system and macroeconomics and these big structural factors. And then somehow I ended up doing a PhD, which was in the Department of Geography, because I was really interested in climate change and water. And so I think I've just kind of been like meandering around different fields, finding a thread that makes sense for me. And I think as we're in a moment now in history where polycrisis is happening, right? Like the different systemic crises are overlapping, and we're starting to see that more around macroeconomic injustice, the climate injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, all these things that I was already passionate about. I seem to have found a space in my current role that makes sense. But I have, yeah, done research in the global south. I did my PhD research in Pakistan, but I've worked in a number of countries. And I think I sort of gradually realized over time, like, I am a white presenting woman who grew up in Manchester. I'm not, like, who am I in this landscape of research, right? I started to think, so I put this picture because it makes me cringe, but it also, it's like binary, right? The experience. So I was in Pakistan, 2011, it was after the mega floods, and I did quite a lot of like ethnographic research with communities that were affected. And at the time, of course, my intention was good, like spend time, understand the stories, bring those stories to light, because there weren't other researchers being funded to do that. And that's the key thing, being funded. Mm-hmm. So my attitude was there aren't researchers doing this. But over time, I realized there were many people there that would have loved to do that work, but I was the one who got funding to do that, right? And that's because of my positionality and the more opportunities that I would get. So I started to question, what's my role? Like, of course, I understand power, racialized experience to an extent, but what's my role as a person who's in North and South? Where do you take space and where do you take a seat? I started to think a lot about that. Like, should I be the one doing research in Pakistan, or should Pakistani researchers be funded to represent their own space? That's not to say that you shouldn't have international researchers in any space, right? But if it's all white folks from the global north who are getting the funding to do the work in a certain context, then we've got an issue. And then who's actually benefiting other than me? I started to question that. Like, I benefited from being able to have opportunities, have an area of expertise, career, and so on. And I'm not saying the work I've been involved in was meaningless, but the most value came from the local researchers. And so, yeah, I guess I came to a point where I was like, how do I use my privilege on the issues that matter to me? And the biggest issue fundamentally around injustice for me is actually more around the knowledge production side, because there are great inequalities in whose voice is heard, who generates the knowledge, who takes the space. And that's just something I've seen my whole career. So somehow this journey has led me to what I'm doing now, and it will start to make sense, I hope. If it doesn't, I'm sorry. It makes sense in my head. So back to the important stuff. So I ended up a couple of years ago joining this initiative called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, but in short, we call it the Fossil Fuel Treaty, because the word non-proliferation freaks people out, understandably. So this graph is something, it's just been updated with new figures. It used to say 110% there. So what this is, it's from a really great report from the UN called the Production Gap Report. They do it every 2 years, and it basically looks at where the world is headed when it comes to fossil fuel production. So when we look at fossil fuels and we look at climate change, climate justice, the international instruments are focused on emissions. They're not focused on the actual driver of climate change, which is fossil fuels. So around 86% of the carbon in our atmosphere over the last 10 years, and quite a substantial part of the methane, which we know is actually very significant now, comes from the extraction and production of fossil fuels. So, but nobody's counting their pathway until recently, right? They're just saying, oh, we'll have these countries will come up with these plans, and then we'll just deal with the emissions. And in those plans, as many of you will know, probably better than me, there's like technologies that don't exist yet. There's plans, there's like outcomes that don't have a pathway. So like X country, we will reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030. But what we're starting to see now is like those things aren't realistic. So for example, I was just looking at Angola's nationally determined contribution. We're doing some research there. And it's just reduced its ambition in the latest NDC, because it's saying actually we can't meet that. And we can't meet that original ambition because the structural constraints for us to move off of fossil fuels are like really ridiculous. And so this is where the structural injustice thing becomes important. But the main takeaway from this is that if we carry on the way we're going now, we're 120% more fossil fuels are going to be produced, and it's compatible with a 1.5 consistent pathway. And we've breached 1.5 degrees already. We've seen the kind of disasters and the loss and damage that are being experienced across the world. But we're more than double, we're going to produce more than double than what we actually need to get to that pathway. And nobody's really got a plan. Basically, the UNFCCC doesn't have a plan for this. In fact, the term fossil fuels only made it into the official negotiating text 2 years ago. So this is like, for me, suddenly really, it was almost like being hit on the head with like the data and the facts. Like no matter how much I work on lessen damage impacts and try and support that work, or like impacts of climate change, if this is the path we were on, like adaptation is never going to be enough. So we need to actually have a plan. And that's what the treaty is proposing, although it's a very hard political proposition. And so I'm not saying it's easy or that will necessarily be successful, although I think we might. The other issue is renewable energy investment, right? So there's this kind of simplistic idea that you can just replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, and that's not actually true. Of course, like renewable energy has huge potential on many levels. It has huge potential in terms of decentralizing energy, access to energy, because fossil fuels actually, if you look at the countries with the highest dependency on fossil fuels across the global south, that doesn't correlate with access. So, you know, access across societies, renewable energy can really help, but actually there's so much more that needs to be considered. It's not just a swap. And how do we know this? Well, there's been so much investment in renewables. It's increasing, although most of that's going to the global north in China, I should say. But fossil fuel investment is also increasing at the same time. So what's happening? Industries are dependent on fossil fuels, and there's no exit plan for industries. So if I take an example of a country we talk to quite fairly often, Kenya is like not a fossil fuel producer. It is thinking about possibly tapping into some, but it's not a fossil fuel producer. But its entire transport and industry depend on fossil fuels, and they don't have support to get off. So that transport electrification, for example, it's quite a big thing to do, and there's no like real structural support for them, basically. So we're in this kind of conundrum where there's all this narrative about renewable energy, and we agree with that. We believe in renewable energy, but we also have to reduce the fossil fuels and support countries to take those steps. I did say like 85% of the renewable energy investment has gone to the global north in China as well. So this is part of the challenge as well, that it's kind of unevenly distributed, the investment in renewables. So what we're saying as a coalition, and that the treaty initiative emerged from activists and campaigners primarily, and some academics who were saying, like, we don't have a plan, we need a plan, and the plan has to be just. So this graph, you don't need to look too much at it, but just those dots in different places in different country names. This comes from a kind of project we've worked on and partnered with called Civil Society Equity Review. So that's like 200 organizations that have looked at this issue of what's called extraction equity. So like which countries are actually continuing to extract and produce fossil fuels that is causing that 120% pathway. And what you tend to see actually is there are many countries across the global south who are, but the ones who are the most focused on extracting and producing fossil fuels are countries like the US, for example, Canada, big countries in the global north, who don't actually need fossil fuels anymore because they have the money, they have the access to capital investment to make the transition, they just don't want to. So what they did, these very smart people that I was not in doing those calculations, developed what they called an extraction equity approach, where you map out a transition timeline so that the richest and most responsible for climate change stop fossil fuel extraction now. And then those who are more dependent on fossil fuel production and those who did the least to cause the problem have more time. And so what they've done here is they've mapped out, this is on oil, so they've mapped out the timelines of when countries should stop. So for example, South Sudan is there at 2050, right? There's many constraints that South Sudan would be facing. Equatorial Guinea is there at 2050. Whereas like there are countries like Italy and the UK who basically have more responsibility, which is this side. They have more capacity and responsibility to phase out now, and they should. The other part of this is the cost calculation. So they also calculated which countries are most responsible for funding and supporting that equitable transition away from fossil fuels. And this has been really, really hard to get on the agenda, but it is now in the international diplomatic agenda. It is something that we're talking about, for example, in the COP space now, although it's not formally in the like negotiating text, but it's a big part of the conversation now, which is they're calling it TAF. Oh my God, what does TAF stand for? Transitioning away from fossil fuels equitably. Okay, so just coming back to like why we exist as an initiative, there isn't an agreement on the transition away from fossil fuels. So if we carry on the way we do now, we're in a moment where there's like fragmented multilateralism, there's a lack of trust between governments. Nobody's really stepping up, except for a few countries that are joining these high ambition coalitions like this one. And so what we have then is like, also outside of that, the consolidation, right, of big business interests, which is happening not just through energy, but also interconnected big business interests around AI and tech. So the transition is sort of happening. But if you look at the international financial markets, and if you look at things like green bonds and so on, you can see that the transition is happening. But the countries that are benefiting at the moment, mostly from the transition, are from the global north, and of course China and some of the other BRICS. But the risks for the rest of the world are really, really rising. And one of the biggest risks is stranded assets. So at the moment, there's tons of investment in liquefied natural gas on the African continent, for example. And of course, many African countries are like, why shouldn't we tap into our gas reserves? We've caused less than 2% of global emissions. Like, we need to service our, our populations with energy. But if you actually analyze it, like over 90% of the deals are for export to Europe. So ever since the war in Ukraine, the dependency on Russian gas, obviously, like, there's been a break there. So European countries are looking elsewhere. What they're doing is they're locking countries into these deals for like 30, 40, and 50 years on liquefied natural gas. So those countries will develop the infrastructure, they'll invest a ton in that, they'll do it for export, while the rest of the world comes off and moves on to renewables. And so the price will drop. And then the companies involved will be expecting the same debt repayments, and those countries won't be selling for the same amount. The gas won't be as valuable. So they'll basically be more indebted as a result. So this is a huge risk, but basically no one's really talking about it in the political space. It's just starting to come up, but it's basically delaying economic diversification as well. So the money that's being invested in these huge fossil fuel projects, what if that was being invested in just transition projects or renewable energy projects? If you look at, again, the continent of Africa, like the cost to get renewable infrastructure, like the investment interest rates are like on average 15.6%. Whereas if they're for Europe or North America, it's like 2 to 6%. So it's really expensive, but it's much cheaper to see fossil fuels. So there's basically this entrapment that's going on, which is really highlighting like the global injustice of what some call like fossil capitalism. There's also, as I was saying, like very powerful pro-fossil fuel constituencies. There's been analysis recently of how much money's been put into lobbying, for example, in the US Senate, and it's absolutely crazy. Over 10 years, it's like over $1 billion has been put into lobbying the US Senate for pro-fossil fuel interests. But those lobbyists do other things regarding democracy. So one of the things that they found is, I think Bloomberg did this investigation. They found that they do things like they draft anti-protest laws for senators to then bring into the Senate. So they're basically helping to consolidate the crackdown on democracy, because democracy isn't serving their interests, basically. It's like big capitalist players. There's something I'm just going to put out there, but I don't have time to talk about it now, but it's a concept that has come up in academia by a researcher called Cara Daggett, called petromasculinity. And so I encourage people to look into that. But that basically looks at like the ties between fossil fuel interests, misogyny, patriarchy, and authoritarian desire. And she's written a really amazing paper on that. And I really think for someone like me, like I'm a feminist researcher, it makes sense. I see it and I'm like, oh, this makes sense. But we need to kind of build awareness, I think, of how these things are interconnected. Like, it's not just the crises, the outcomes, it's also the root causes of those that are interconnected. Okay, so one of the biggest criticisms we've had as an initiative is like, well, we've spent decades working on this one framework, this convention, the UNFCCC. Like, why are you coming and distracting now? Like, we've put particularly at philanthropy, is like we've put so much money into getting this to work. Now we've got fossil fuels in the text. Like, why are you distracting from it? And I think when we started as a campaign, we were kind of like, I wasn't there then, but we have some amazing campaigners. So I think they really like went in with a bang and said, this isn't working, we need something else. But that's not exactly what we think. I mean, we think that it's not working, but we're not suggesting that the UNFCCC gets thrown out. There's a few reasons for that. One is it's actually the biggest civil society gathering in the world, the COPs. So it's actually the greatest opportunity for civil society to get together and coalesce around a huge issue of social justice. So from that perspective, it's important. For many countries in the global south, they tell us that it's one of the only spaces where they feel they have some level of parity in space, at least in being able to represent what they think as negotiating blocks and countries, even though there are like lots of politics and dynamics that play out. So we're not suggesting it be abandoned, but we are saying it needs like a framework to sit underneath it to actually make it like happen. Because otherwise we can just have these empty commitments to emissions reduction. And the latest thing is tech, right? And of course, this is why I mentioned the tech bros, because I don't know if any of you have seen that film, Don't Look Up. Have you seen it? Mm-hmm. So for those who haven't, like, it's a spoof on basically how frustrating it can be to work in climate stuff. And one of the things they have is like a tech bro come in and be like, well, we're going to like put carbon on the moon or whatever, which is actually a thing that's happening. Like there is investment in like solar panels on the moon, not the moon, Mars, whatever, some place out there. So there's all this money, even in this country, like this, you know, the UK government has invested this year 22 billion into carbon capture and storage tech, right? And I'm not saying I'm not saying we'll never need any carbon capture and storage. I don't know, but it's definitely not a silver bullet. Like there's no way, based on the progress so far of CCS, there's no way it's going to fix our problem with regards to the emissions. We need something more bold. And we're just getting distracted. So we're basically saying, look, we need a plan. We need a managed transition. It needs to have justice and equity at the centre. And so we can come up behind the UNFCCC. And we have this briefing, which is not written by me, so I can say very good, which summarizes like how we're offering to support the outcome there. Okay, so since 3 years ago, we've got 17 nations that are on board with the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. But it's really important to say, like, there's no negotiating text. What we're doing now is like talking about there's a need for a treaty, and we're building the building blocks of like what that might look like. And my role is quite focused on like what the mechanisms might be, which I'll talk about a bit later. So these are the countries, most of them, as you can see, are small island developing states, the most vulnerable groups to the climate crisis overall. You know, many of them are facing actual existential like crisis, being wiped away. Like one of our participating nations showed a video the last time we met, like over 2 months, how much land was just taken by the coast. Like it's huge. So that's, you know, of course they're joining us, but they're also very important for global diplomacy, climate diplomacy in other ways, as you'll see in a bit, or you probably already know. And yeah, this is all on our website. So, but basically it's many NGOs are into this. What would it involve? There are 3 pillars. So a just transition is kind of related to what I was talking about before. So like moving your economy away from fossil fuels is really hard. It's not easy, and it has to have support for nations who didn't cause the problem and who are facing the biggest barriers. Like one of the biggest barriers is debt, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Non-proliferation, this is a bit, you know, misread often as like we're expecting countries to stop right now, but actually what we're talking about is like, let's not make the crisis worse, particularly in countries that don't need fossil fuels and don't need to keep expanding oil and gas infrastructure. Like, let's just see where we are and try and come back from it, because if we carry on, we're in trouble. And then a fair phase out. So those timelines according to who has the most responsibility. So the wealthy nations moving fastest and first. Okay, sorry, it's been a lot of information. Now I've got some videos, so break from that. But yeah, like, okay, a lot of the people we work with are involved in all sorts of different areas of international law with regards to climate. So we are constantly involved sort of peripherally, or we have certain colleagues of ours who've been involved in, whether it's ICJ, like the Pacific students, for example, who championed the ICJ advisory opinion, like they've been in our network from the very beginning. Like we've got colleagues who've been super involved in the plastics treaty and in the ecocide campaign. So, but I feel like I didn't know enough about all of these things when I started. So I have videos for each of them in case it's useful. But again, I know some of you probably know more than me. So this is where we are on ecocide. Will it work? Yes. Okay. So, wait, how do I go back to the slides?
You minimize on the top.
Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. So, Dr. Yusra knows much more about the eco side law than I do, or the campaign. But I think, yeah, quite a number of our partners and civil society organisations are super actively campaigning. One of them is, for example, the Palestine Institute for Climate Strategies. So this is a new organisation which was set up by young people from Gaza, basically. And they're making the case now, they've just released their manifesto actually, that of course, like, they're making the case that genocide is happening, but they're also making the case really effectively that ecocide is happening in that place. And I think this is going to like be very much kind of part of the narrative of, you know, like I suppose as what's successfully campaigning in international law on climate. I think ecocide seems to be something that everyone can start to feel and get their heads around, especially with what's happening in Gaza and some of the research that's been coming out there. The other part of international law that is relevant for us is the Plastics Treaty. Again, like I've been around working on this and my colleagues have been going and negotiating, and I still feel like I don't fully get it. But of course, like plastics is, you know, fossil fuels are like absolutely essential to plastics, right? So like we sort of say that if we're going to have a fossil fuel treaty, we absolutely have to be linked with the outcomes of the plastic treaty negotiations. And we have to basically support countries to deal with the issue of plastics because it's so huge for their economies. But the negotiations kind of in the context that we're in right now, they were going pretty well. And then the last round of negotiations crashed. And there's a summary here, which I think is just useful. I think this is the issue is trying to pursue international law obligations and breakthroughs that the current state of the world is, raises barriers and challenges, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep pushing. So. Okay, so the challenge here, which we're trying to overcome in our work, is you need to get consensus in UN negotiations, right? So that means every country has to pretty much agree. And the way that the country blocks operate, so you have negotiating blocks that represent the interests of different groups of countries. And you see times in history, there are eras where there's more interesting cooperation because the outside world has more interesting cooperation. But where we are in the world right now, there's just been a kind of really, and you see this in the UNFCCC space, like a backtrack. And I think, we're not in a moment where countries and blocs feel compelled to cooperate, basically. And that what that's doing is affecting our progress on a number of areas where things felt that they were moving along. So why am I mentioning this? The fossil fuel treaty is not a consensus-based treaty. It's a treaty of high ambition. It's a high ambition coalition, basically, of countries that we've seen in the past with other treaties that can be an effective way of pushing the Overton window, or sort of like the political window of opportunity, by bringing a bigger group together, a high ambition group together who are going to kind of push the agenda in international spaces. Okay, and then the final one, I promise it's the last one, but this is good news. Again, some of you will be aware This is one of our campaigners, Dominique. Oh, how do I put the sound on? There we go. But it's really, I mean, I think stubborn optimism is the word. Like, I think there's a discourse shift happening amongst people, even if the multilateral system is not cooperating right now. I think there's many factors in that. Like we've seen youth mobilizations on a number of critical issues where we feel, and I say we, because I'm definitely not in the youth category anymore, but folks feel that the system is not fair, right? And certain issues are playing out in front of them where they feel that justice is not happening. And so there's a mobilization, and there's always been there's been a strong climate movement. As I said, it's like the UNFCCC is the biggest gathering of civil society annually in the world. So there is some optimism in the youth. There is optimism in campaigners and groups that feel like while we're in this current state, there might not be political cooperation, but we can have discursive shifts, right? We can shift the conversation around what needs to happen, and we can also start to articulate our demands. So this is something that why I enjoy working for the Fossil Fuel Treaty is, I've worked in climate justice for a long time, and there is a big difference between demonstrating and articulating and witnessing the problem and actually articulating clear policy demands. And that link is rare. Even I've worked for NGOs in the past. I love them. I think they're incredible. But our policy demands were often very general. And so they could then be interpreted however they want by government. This initiative, we're actually developing mechanisms that would be more specific, right? That governments, if they would get behind it in the negotiating room, if they actually agree to the negotiating text, will have specific policy levers that they would need to be implementing and for specific things around safeguarding and transparency and so on. So we're very ambitious around the articulation of the policy. And I'll give a couple of examples, but they're not super developed at this stage. And this is why it's good to speak to researchers, by the way, because I work with researchers all the time. And a lot of it is this kind of creative space for thinking about what should we be doing, what's the evidence we need. So, yeah. I just wanted to share, it's just been announced. Yeah, I'm sure you know the text, don't worry. But the first international conference, diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out, has been announced by Colombia. And that's going to be hosted in April in Colombia. And that came about from the 17 nations that we work with. Over the last year, we've been talking about how do we push more diplomatic energy around fossil fuel phase out in a time where there's very little cooperation, right? And I think we're noticing that there's the discursive shift happening, and these shifts are happening in international law. So now is a time to put energy behind this idea that we can do this, and that some countries are willing to sit around the table together and talk about what needs to happen next. So these are just quotes from the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia, and then Ralph Regan, who we work with closely, the Minister of Climate Change in Vanuatu, basically saying why this is important, and I'm happy to share the slides. But before I go into the mechanism stuff, I just wanted to share that like this is because we're working with 4,000 NGOs, and many of them believe in this the need to shift the cultural conversation, right? So it's not just about the legal side, but you need to engage people, you need to bring people on the journey. So we work with a number of NGOs that do that. This is actually a band called This Is Our Home. So they actually ended up touring with Coldplay last year. Like it was really, so they're from the Pacific, and we've been supporting them because they basically have been writing all their music about like the existential crisis of climate change and why we need climate justice. And so we were kind of speaking to different funders and saying, you should really fund this band because they're like starting this conversation. And we went to Brian Eno's studio. He's like this, he was in a big band in the UK. He's an activist and he funds a lot of really great climate justice work. And he was so impressed with them that he called Chris Martin and said, you've got to see this guy, go see this band. And then Chris Martin was like, come on our tour. Yeah. And so they then toured with Coldplay last year with the key message that, you know, like our futures are shrinking, but we're not going to give up. Like, we need to get behind this message. So there are like these artivism approaches which are important for public engagement as well, which we're involved in, but I don't have time to go too much into detail. We recently had like an African artist pledge. So we were in Ethiopia for the Africa Climate Summit a couple of weeks ago, and we had an African artist pledge, and they put art, and we had an exhibition. So we do think like we're not abandoning the campaigning, the activism. That's absolutely central to what we do. Here's another example from Baku, where the COP was last year. You know, we get together with others in the movement. It's not just about talking about a fossil fuel treaty. We get behind other demands, like pay up is a demand on loss and damage finance. We work with many, many movements basically in it. I just don't have time to go into that now. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to like just touch on the surface a little bit of some of the mechanism stuff and where I definitely would love to work with more researchers. So just putting that out there. So if we're saying that countries need to come together and develop a plan for fossil fuel phase out, we need to address the like really systemic barriers that they face. And like debt is absolutely critical. And for those of you who might be aware, this year is technically a jubilee year on debt. So the Pope basically announced after 25 years, which was the last jubilee, that debt and climate justice and war were the three biggest issues that need to be dealt with. And a bunch of like big conferences happened this year where there was supposed to be an outcome on debt. So one of them was called FFD4, Financing for Development 4 Summit, which I went to as well. And the purpose there was to have a multilateral outcome on debt injustice, but basically didn't happen. So it's not only in climate change or in addressing genocide or whatever, right, that there is a multilateral cooperation. It's happening across the board at the moment. So for the countries that want to actually phase out and they have no support, like the debt crisis is just a huge issue. So the number of countries that are in debt crisis or near to debt crisis has like tripled in the last 10 years. There are more than, I think, 50 or 60 countries in the world. I think it's more than 60 countries that spend more on debt servicing than they can spend on health and education. You've got countries that are spending like huge part, they have like a debt to GDP ratio of over 100%. So like if that's the case, if you have a debt to GDP ratio of over 100%, so much of your public budget has to go to service debt. How are you ever going to have a fossil fuel transition? You also need to deal with health, you need to deal with education, you need to make sure that people are eating the basic, like fundamental rights and freedoms. It's impossible. Like I've got some stats actually, which I have in my phone here. Yeah, so 2/3 of low-income countries are now in debt distress or at high risk, and 10 years ago it was a lot less. In 2023, the world's lowest income nations paid out nearly $60 billion in debt servicing. So they're paying that out just on the interest on debt, right? But they received half of that in climate finance. So like debt crisis is escalating and it's costing them more. So they're having to service their debts and then they're experiencing loss and damage. So if we look at Pakistan, if we look at Grenada, 2022 floods in Pakistan, $30 billion worth of damage in just a number of days. In Grenada, similarly, over $30 billion US dollars in damage in like 3 days. So what does that do? It pushes them further into debt. So this is a huge issue and there aren't really solutions on the table. So we're trying to create some solutions, and we're working with the debt justice movement to kind of bridge to what they're doing, to demonstrate that it is possible that countries can do some stuff together in a time when no one really wants to do anything together, basically. Capital costs I already mentioned. The cost of capital is hugely prohibitive. So most countries across the global south, unless they're part of the BRICS, or if they have a very specific bilateral relationship, aren't getting the finance they need to make the transition anyway. Then you have these things called innovative financing. So this is where governments in the global north don't want to pay what they agreed to under the UNFCCC process. But instead they go outside and they basically make these deals. And one of them, which was partly spearheaded by the UK and the EU, are called JETPs, Just Energy Transition Partnerships. So they have one in South Africa, in Indonesia, in Senegal. And most of these, it only addresses, like the grant is only like 6% or something, 6 to 8%. The rest of it is debt creating finance. And there's this issue of additionality. So basically they get some money and then they're expected to create more money themselves. And that's just not how it works when the capital cost is so high. So a lot of these just energy transition partnerships are heavily criticised basically for not being a solution. This is generally the issue with what's called innovative financing. It's not to say that there aren't some projects that work, but there are huge issues, and it's basically like a distraction from paying the international climate finance that's actually owed. And then the final piece, I'm not an expert, but I'm very aware at this point that trade inequities are absolutely huge. And so if you're trying to build a new economy, a green economy that's moving away from fossil fuels, but you can't access the tech you need because the intellectual property rights are all owned by companies in the global north, you can't make deals, how are you supposed to make the transition? So these are like huge barriers that we're basically doing what we can to try and figure out, like, is there something we can offer in our platform that can address some of this, acknowledging that this is a huge structural issue which we can't fully fix. Then, of course, law is central to all of this. Every single one of those areas has a legal element to it, right? So we have to work with lawyers, international financial lawyers, environmental lawyers. This is where I wish I was a lawyer because I don't understand enough of a lot of it. But one of the big issues on the table at the moment, as I'm sure many of you know, are ISDS, so investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, basically where companies in the global north can sue, or it doesn't even need to be in the north, like companies can basically sue. Thanks for coming. Let's say, like, I think the UK is actually subject to a lawsuit at the moment. So the UK has made a commitment to phase out coal, and I think one of the companies that it had made the contract with is now suing it. So we have the economic resilience because of our colonial history, I think, to navigate that, but that isn't the case for a lot of countries in the south. So the risk and the threat of ISDS is putting a lot of countries in the south off even trying to make the transition. So apparently the fossil fuel industry is the biggest user of ISDS, surprise, surprise, and there's at least 231 known treaty-based ISDS claims at the moment, with an average award around 256 million over the last 10 years. So it's huge. And of course, there's the litigation costs and all of the other factors. So there's a paper from our partner organisation, Centre for International Environmental Law, that's really helpful on this. And they say it's like a chilling effect, basically, which is really preventing progress on the transition. So yes, we need things like that can start to overcome those. Like, what are the agreements countries can make around ISDS if they're joining this high ambition coalition? Without going into much detail, like, these are the 3 areas of mechanisms I'm working on really intensively at the moment. So obviously debt is one. So I'm working with some researchers on, like, what would a debt resolution mechanism look like that a treaty could offer? Then there's a whole area of finance and investment, like, okay, debt fees aren't working, that's what's not working. What would be a fairer approach to finance? Like, there's a whole question of whose finance, is it public finance, or is it private finance? And we're trying to figure out, like, what would we offer? Like, what would the rules be? How do we help countries overcome the barriers? And then the final piece is on replacing fossil fuel revenue at scale and speed, because in some countries, I mentioned Angola before, Angola, Nigeria, good examples, like their GDP, over 90% of their GDP depends on fossil fuel revenues. So, like, how do you even have that conversation with a government that's so dependent, the public budget is so dependent on fossil fuels? There needs to be like a fair kind of managed pathway that they can engage with, and nobody's investing in that research. So we've basically invested in some research on that. we've got studies, happy to talk about them, but yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to kind of close it up. But happy to share. Yeah, I suppose the final piece, which isn't under the finance piece, but it's really important. Again, we really need to work with researchers on is the safeguarding mechanisms. So we're offering incentives to countries to come together and like have this coalition where they can access new forms of finance or new preferential trade agreements if they agree to transition away from fossil fuels. What are they going to do that upholds like basic like issues around safeguarding? So, for example, free, prior, and informed consent. Like that's a huge issue. A lot of governments, there are issues over land tenure, right? So big mega projects often involve governments taking land away from indigenous and local people. So there are issues around that we need to think about. There are issues around basic standards, transparency, grievance mechanisms, all of those. And that work is being mapped at the moment. We really need to work on it. But one area that has been successful in safeguarding mechanisms, which we're strongly considering as a mechanism within the treaty, is this solar geoengineering non-use agreement, which again, I'm not an expert on, although I have colleagues on. So solar geoengineering is somewhat in the space, I believe, of like what we were talking about before, like putting solar panels on Mars and stuff, just tech stuff that could be very problematic for local environments. And there has been a campaign which has basically got the agreement of hundreds of countries now not to include solar geoengineering in their kind of future climate plans. So that's kind of a top line agreement, but like if we do have a treaty, you could include something like that in the treaty agreement. So there's some like accountability for governments so they can't change their mind and have a huge solar geoengineering like project after they've decided that that's going to help them, basically. And I'm going to stop there. All right.